All right, hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We're starting a new book, the book of Judges. And we are also going into a new, not only generation, but one that will be, even reading it will be frustrating. The never-ending cycle of Israel's sin. And not to put a pun on the title, not judging here, but because I think it also shows the sinfulness of man. Now, with Israel, however, what makes their sin more astounding is, remember, they had God. They were the only nation that had God present, not just a figment, right? Not just a figure that they worship. Now all the nations around them worship pagan images, pagan gods, right? Israel had the true God who manifests himself with his presence. And yet, Israel will covet the pagan worship of the wicked nations around them. And so we're going to see this going back and forth, right? Their fall and then their deliverance. Now, the term judge and the term that as it is used in this book were saviors, deliverers that God raised up to deliver Israel once they have sinned. So right away they fall into sin. Now, if you think about this too, we see this, remember, we see this with man and his, for some reason, the very rapid decline into sin, right? We go all the way back to Genesis, and we know Adam fell in his sin fairly quickly. Amazing, right? And we see the same thing here, that the Israel will fall into sin just coming off of one of the greatest generations that they've ever seen, Joshua. And it just won't take long. So God will raise up these judges because he will judge. Okay, so this word judge here has kind of some multi avenues in here. He's going to judge Israel for their sins, and he'll raise up judges to deliver them. The word judge itself might be a little misleading in that it's more like a deliverer, okay? Except that during this period of the judges, they also administered justice for the people. They also acted as judges, somewhat leaders. They led Israel. The phrase will be that they judged Israel. And the phrase that they judged Israel means that they would also, besides delivering them from their enemies, they would also administer justice. So they kind of kept the people on whatever path, the right path, or I should say, attempting to keep the people on the path. So and so thus the term judge had a kind of a dual role. One, they would administer justice. We're going to see later that Samuel would go in the circuit, right, from town to town, and the people would bring their problems to them. And if you kind of go back to when Moses um, in the book of Exodus, we see that Moses, I think it's Exodus 18, I want to say, but don't quote me on this. But Jethro, and we're going to see his descendants later on in this chapter, but I think chapter 2. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. Now, you remember Moses when he fled from Egypt, he spent 40 years in the wilderness. Well, that 40 years, remember, was as Jethro's son-in-law. He married his daughter Zipporah. And when God appeared to Moses and sent him back to Egypt to deliver Israelites, about in the third month, I think second month, Jethro brought his wife out, and then they had a great fellowship. And then after they had this great fellowship, the next day, the people would come to Moses from sunup to sundown. And Jethro was like, man, what are you doing? He was like, well, the people, they come and ask the counsel of God. They come with their questions. They come with their problems. And at that time, Jethro gave him great advice by saying, you need to raise up leaders who could judge the people, and thus you won't carry the burden of the people by yourself. And that's eventually what happened. So the idea of the judge who these people God would raise up, they will also act, like say, in an administrative function to guide the people in the right path. Settle, to judge between the difficulties, the questions, all the issues that they would have. Now, it's kind of interesting because on the deliverer side, there was oftentimes we're going to see that God won't choose a judge or a deliverer based upon his ability. In other words, most of the judges or deliverers will have no ability, but God will give them the ability. In the case of Samson, remember, it was God's strength. God gave him the strength. And interesting thing about Samson, because you always see these pictures of this great muscular man. I don't know if that's often the picture that is given about Samson. In other words, the fact that he's a big, huge, muscular man, he could be a little Barney Fife, little slim man. And well, the issue with Samson was that God gave him his strength. Excuse me. He might have been and he might have not. I'm saying is that, but the most, the pictures that you oftentimes see about Samson is that he is, big, strong, muscular, guy, and that's that. And I'm saying those are kind of misleading because it almost seems as though because he's muscular, he's strong. And whether he was muscular or not had nothing to do with it. God gave him his strength. All right. So, we're going to see that God, when they would fall into sin, God is going to raise up these deliverers who will deliver Israel from their sin. So this is, and then there's going to be some dark stories as we move through Judges, especially towards the end. Which is kind of interesting because the book of Judges also kind of shows us one of the greatest opportunities, greatest advantage or moments that Israel had was that they didn't have a king, that they all kind of function as more so a theocracy. In other words, this is probably the greatest time that you would see a theocracy minus the king. And when we get towards the end of the period of the Judges, what they're going to do, they're going to ask for a king. And that's going to be very interesting, that they're going to ask for a king. Now, The period of the judgment is about 450 years. And thus, as we're moving through, we're kind of getting a timeline that you could, even as we count down. Now, remember in the Old Testament, you start with the birth of Jesus, right? So, in our historic, right now, as we think here, and I'm going to do a little sidebar here. The term common era, CEA, I believe it is, and then versus AD BC. AD BC. So AD is after the death of Christ, BC is before the death of Christ, and then sometimes you see people use the term common era. Era meaning era, common era, okay, the time. So you start with Jesus' birth. So in either case, you start with Jesus' birth or death. That time. So as we kind of come forward after his death, we say, like, for example, now the year is 2022. So you go back 2022 years to the death of Christ, and we could pretty much stay within that accurate time as far as, counting history. So that the 2022 2,000 year period of time, fairly active because you can count history. And pretty much the same when you count the BC age, or what we would call the Old Testament. You started Jesus' birth and then you start counting back. So it started there. So it almost seems like it's a reverse kind of, timing. So like when we say the time of the judges is about a 1,500 year period, right? I think it's like 1350, 1400, what they call BC. So we're counting backwards, so to speak. So if you start with the birth of Jesus and you start counting backwards, that's why you see the term, the book of the Judges, around 13 or 1400 BC. But in other words, we're talking about a 1400 year time that we're counting down. We can start counting this time period. Another thing is, we know that from the time that Israel came out of Egypt with about 480 years, okay, to the building of the temple. Okay, all of these is, if you want to do math and you want to kind of get all off, do some math there, you could do that. Okay, that's one of the ways you can calculate. So as we move through, I'm going to kind of just get into the opening here. But as we go through the book of Judges again, I don't get into the author. We don't know who the author is. There's speculations. But the book of Judges, like Joshua, seems to be written within that time period. Maybe the end of it, but certainly during that time period. And we'll cover those with indicators as we go through. So let's get into it. Joshua chapter 1. Joshua chapter, Judges, not Joshua. Judges chapter 1. Now it says, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord who would be first to fight for us against the Canaanites. Now, one thing about this too that's going to come up is the idea or notion that we see here, it's at the death of Joshua, and then when we get into chapter 2, we're going to also see an accounting of the death of Joshua. And you might say, well, what's going on here with this? And remember, in the Old Testament, sometimes we'll see this pattern where you will see first a detail told, a story told, a pattern told, and then you will see they would come back and then zero in on certain details. We saw that with Genesis chapter 1. So Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. It wasn't a retelling of the stories. It was, you see, in chapter 1, there's a focus on the 6 days of creation, and then in chapter 2, it comes back and focus on the creation of man, the creation of sort of the creation of the birds, and the commission, I should say, the commission of man, and then of course the creation of man and woman. Okay, and sort of the same thing is going on here with chapter 1. We're going to see a set of details that's given, and then in chapter 2 we're going to get in further details. They're going to zero in on these further details, and you'll see that when we get to chapter 2. I'm just kind of pointing it out now. So it says, after the death of Joshua, so this is kind of a general statement too, right? The Israelites inquired of the Lord, who would be the first to fight for us against the Canaanites. The Lord answered, Judah is to go. I have handed the land over to him. Now this is going to start off right, because remember, we're right off of the generation of Joshua. Okay. Now again, there's some very interesting thing about the generation of Joshua. I'll wait till I get to chapter 2 to get into it. But the other question is, how did they inquire? Right? Now you remember there was a thing called the Urim and the Thummim. There was also prophets. So this is probably how when they inquired of the Lord, and then the Lord answered them through prophets, things like that. And even though one particular prophet is not named, remember Moses was himself a prophet. Verse 3. Let's see if I can get away this here. I don't need this. All right. All right. I'm trying to get rid of all this add here stuff. Okay. Oh, here we go. That's what I wanted to get away. All right. All right. Verse 3. Judah said to his brother Simeon, come with me to my territory, and let us fight against the Canaanites. I will also go with you to your territory. So Simeon went with him. When Judah attacked, the Lord handed the Canaanites and the Perizzites over to him. They struck down 10,000 men of Bezek. They found Abani Bezek in Bezek, fought against him, and struck down the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Now this Perizzites. Now again, this is not going to be this victories are going to be short-lived as far as Israel is concerned. Verse 6. When Adonai Bezek fled, they pursued him, seized him, cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Now, let me stop, because this may seem harsh, but in the very next verse we're going to see the justification of this. The reason why I wanted to, let me read verse 7, then I'll come back and comment, because this is kind of this is, I think, important to understand when we see these things, and we're going to see them throughout, Israel. We're going to, our study in Judges as well as the entire Old Testament. So I'm going to read verse 6 again. When Abani Bezek fled, they pursued him, seized him, cut off his thumbs and big toes. Abani Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps. Let me read that verse 7 again. Abani Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. God has repaid me for what I've done. They brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. Now, the reason why I wanted to kind of make a point here is it seems rough, right? Seems kind of, wow, that was rough. But understand that this guy was a very cruel king. In other words, the dirt, the evil that he's done, right, was always just worse than what you may think. And so that is why you see that this is it's a just way of winding here. And we're going to see this kind of throughout, how wicked man could be. Just how wicked. All right, guys. We'll pick it up at this point, chapter 1 again in the next study. I'll see you then.